round. I'll tell you the story. Once upon a time, there was a gnome king, and the gnome king owned some jewel mines. Now, he had lots of gnomes working for him, and they would go digging in this mine every day, and each one of them brought home 12 jewels, no more and no less. But there were 4 gnomes who regularly brought a different number. Now, the first of these was Multiply. A Multiply was golden and bright and shining. And so he could light up all the dark corners of the mine. And he brought home many more than just the 12 jewels. Now, Plus was fat and green and greedy. And he was very quick about gathering up lots and lots of jewels from the mine. But he didn't want to bring more than 12 jewels to the king, so he padded his pockets with them. And his saying was, "My pants I pad with all I add." But the Gnome King knew him pretty well, and so when he got to the Gnome King's treasure house, the Gnome King turned him upside down, and out fell some of the jewels. Now, the third gnome was Minos. And Minos had holes in his pockets and holes in his clothes, and he was always losing things. So while he found more than 12 jewels, he lost so many of them that he almost never came to the Gnome King with more than 12. And he said, "Raggedy Blue, what shall I do?" But there was another gnome. Now, he also didn't come in with more than 12 jewels either, because he was so heartfelt and so good that he was willing to share his with Minos. So at least Minos got 12 jewels to give to the Gnome King. And his name was Divide. Now, while these 4 gnomes, some brought less and some brought more, the Gnome King knew that he had a pretty good deal with these 4 gnomes, because he knew that on the average they brought in more than 12 jewels apiece. And you can embroider that story and keep on adding to it. You can use those little flattened marbles for jewels. And the reason we teach the 4 processes at this age, and we don't really usually use them for more than a total of 20 or 24 as a total number. But just so the children get the relationship between and among these 4 processes. Several years ago, when the U.S. decided that they needed welfare reform, they started putting welfare recipients, including mothers with 4 children, back to minimum wage jobs of $4 an hour. And many of these people had graduated from high school and needed to get their graduate equivalent degree. And so that was my job, to get them through the GED exam. And when I told them that subtraction was the opposite of addition, and that multiplication and division were the opposite of each other, and that multiplication was just a series of additions, they said, "Really?" Most of these people had gotten through the 8th or 9th or 10th grade at least. But they were taught addition in 1st grade, subtraction in 2nd grade, and it was like a different subject. They weren't ready in the first place to go to school, probably. And when they got there, it just went right over their heads. And it was a real aha for them to find out that those things are related to each other. So it's really a worthwhile thing to introduce them all together and keep using them all together as you go on through the years. And you can draw wonderful pictures of what happens with these gnomes. The front of my math book has a similar picture to this, where the gnome king is turning the Mr. Greedy Plus upside down, and all his jewels are falling out of his pockets. And children love to dress up as these things. All you need is various colored gauze, like you see up here. You know, one of each color of these, and maybe a purple one for the king, and a crown of some kind to put on the king's head, and you can act it all out. And the children love to do it, to act out these things. So there'll be more math in first grade. There's a wonderful Waldorf school curriculum on the chart on the board over there. This book of mine has summaries for each grade, and it also summarizes what I've been talking about as far as the development of the child at the various ages. Talks a little bit about organization of the home and rhythm and all those kinds of things in this book, so you may want to take a look at it. Now, Waldorf is a very interdisciplinary way of learning. So many of our subjects apply to science, history, social studies, all together. In second grade, we do Aesop's fables and other animal stories as one of the main lesson blocks. The reason we do that, and there are a couple of reasons. Aesop's fables show animals as very specific, having a very specific talent. You know, the eagle can fly and he can soar, and the turtle is very purposeful, but he gets there. The cow is mostly a digestive system. It does very little but eat. So it has little spindly legs and all that. And so we don't point this out to the child, but by telling these stories, the child learns how these animals have specific talents. They also demonstrate human foibles, failings that people have, that human beings have. Later in the year, we study saint legends and admirable, perfect people who've overcome these foibles. We don't really point this out to the children, but they've seen both sides, and we don't have to point it out. It's there within them. This whole thing is a big smorgasbord that they take in, and then later on, in later elementary school and high school, they organize what they've learned and put it in categories. But we don't need to put it in categories for them yet. The other thing that happens in fourth grade, when we study man and animal in science, and that's really our first real science as science, we learn that human beings are generalists. And because human beings can think, we can make airplanes that allow us to fly. We can make ladders and cranes that allow us to climb. We can make machines and tools that will help us do things that animals can do, only each one of them. So it's this progression that we're talking about here. That each little main lesson block leads us on to another one. Plus the fact that children in this age group, right here, are very interested in animals. They love animals. And so they have a lot of sympathy with the animals. That's where they are. There are lots of animal stories besides Aesop's. There are Celtic stories, and you probably have some wonderful Aboriginal stories here about animals. Do you have any books that with Aboriginal stories in them?
I don't think so.
About animals?
I had back at my store, but I don't think I bought them up yet.
I think Eric Fairman's book has some in for second grade. So these are, you're not limited to Aesop. And you're not limited to Christian saints either. You can find admirable people in almost every culture that you can use. So you would do 3 or 4 main lesson blocks dealing with animals and with admirable people story. Local folklore is often a fun thing to do in second grade too. And then you're continuing with the math. Whole numbers, beginning to work on the times tables through 12. Number patterns and column adding. Situation problems, head work math, and time and money. And if you're homeschooling, a lot of these things are just going to happen in the process of the day. You don't have to have a main lesson on time if you have clocks in your house. You can begin to say, well, at such and such a time we're going to do this, and at such a time we're going to do this. And they'll just learn to tell time. It's better to have, analog clocks than digital ones. Just because an analog clock is much more representative of what really happens. Time is kind of circular, and it goes around and around. But it's hard to get rid of those digital clocks. They flash on every appliance that you buy, just about. But have some analog clocks too. And money also usually gets taken care of. If you take your children shopping and do things like that with them, they learn to deal with money. So when you're homeschooling, it's not necessary to do a main lesson block on every one of these topics, because many of them are just going to fit into your life and don't need it. Handwork, you continue doing every day if possible. Continue with knitting. Oftentimes in second grade, the children learn to crochet as well. And again, recorder, singing, and language if you can do it. We don't recommend that people use tapes for language, if possible. See if you can find a native speaker who can play with your child. Third grade, Old Testament stories meets the need of the 9 to 10-year-old change. The stories of Adam and Eve in the garden, disobeying, and the Jews escaping from Egypt, disobeying God over and over and over again and getting the consequences and still doing it, really meets the needs of the child of this age. In the U.S., we study Native Americans, some. Here, you would probably study Aborigines, and it fits right in with the other things that you're covering. Food, clothing, and shelter are really important things in third grade. You'll cover all 3 of those. And if you look into the way that Aboriginal peoples lived and what they used to build their homes, what they ate, and how that fit in with the climate where they lived, it's very useful. And then you look into how a modern shelter is built, a modern home. And study clothing, fabric and fiber, and food, including farming. And there's some wonderful resources on that. Again, your math main lesson blocks you intersperse with the other ones. And continue with handwork. Again, you'd be continuing with crocheting probably. Usually around third grade, they start with the diatonic recorder. That's an 8-note scale. The pentatonic is a 5-note scale. Fourth grade, I mentioned the study of man and animal, and that's your first real science as such. I mean, they've been exposed to scientific things before, but only in a very experiential way. And now you begin to put it together and do a lot of sketching of animals, trips to the zoo, and watching wildlife can be very helpful in this. They also study the Norse myths. Children around fourth grade, past the 9-year change, enjoy these stories. They're gross stories, some of them. You know, the world is created out of sweat and saliva and things like that. And they're really into slime and that kind of thing when they're around fourth grade. So it meets their needs. It's very earthy. You would study some local geography, continue with the math. By fourth grade, they should pretty much know their multiplication tables. And I'll talk a little bit more about that during the movement section, but one of the things that we do with children around third grade is to make a multiplication table. You can see in the first column, horizontally you count by 1, the first column vertically you count by 1s, second column by 2s, and so on. So whenever 2 lines meet, like 3 times 2 is 6, and so on. And this is a crutch that it's okay for them to use for a while. Probably by the end of fourth grade, they should be able to put it away and have it memorized. But it's a fun thing to make. This is made out of an old sheet that we folded 12 by 12 and wrote on with crayon, and then we ironed it so it's permanent. And then we made a little pocket bag for it to go in with a twisty twirly for a handle. In fourth grade, it's somewhere towards the end of third and beginning of fourth grade, is the first time you begin to allow the children to do their own composition, rather than you summarizing the story and having them copy it. They come up with their own summary. They write it on a scrap piece of paper, and then you help them correct it. And in the home situation, you don't have to teach grammar as a separate subject. You can teach it as you go over what they've written. And say, you know, you need a capital at the beginning of this word and a period, or the sentence and a period at the end, and we have to have a subject and a verb, and you converse with them as you correct what they've written. And it's a much more meaningful way to do grammar. It's hard to do it that way in a classroom, but very easy at home. And again, handwork. You would maybe do some counted cross-stitch embroidery, and I'll talk a little more about that tomorrow. And playing the recorder. And at this point, you can begin to play duets. Not just rounds, but where the parts are actually different from each other. Okay, you're going to be progressing as time goes on. Now, in fifth grade,